Christianity first arrived in North Africa in the 1st or early 2nd century AD. The Christian communities in North Africa were among the earliest in the world. Legend has it that Christianity was brought from Jerusalem to Alexandria on the Egyptian coast by Mark, one of the 4 evangelists, in 60 AD. In 312, Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. In the 7th century, Christianity retreated under the advance of Islam, but it remained the chosen religion of the Ethiopian Empire and persisted in pockets in North Africa. In the 15th century, Christianity came to sub-Saharan Africa with the arrival of the Portuguese. In the south of the continent, the Dutch founded the beginnings of the Dutch Reformed Church in 1652. In the interior of the continent, most people continued to practice their own religions, undisturbed until the 19th century. At that time, Christian missions to Africa increased, driven by an anti-slavery crusade and the interest of Europeans in colonizing Africa. However, where people had already converted to Islam, Christianity had little success.
So now the question is, who exactly brought Christianity to Africa? Was it Mark, the apostle, or the Dutch? And if it was the Dutch, then who? All right, let's find out in just a few minutes.
You see, the Gospel of Mark, traditionally attributed to Mark the Evangelist, is one of the earliest accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. Early Christians, inspired by this Gospel, embarked on missionary journeys to spread the Christian faith across regions, including Africa. The Gospel of Mark, believed to have been written around the year 70 AD, is one of the earliest accounts of Jesus Christ's life and teachings. Mark's Gospel is notable for its concise and vivid narrative, focusing on Jesus' actions and miracles, as well as his suffering and death. This Gospel was instrumental in shaping early Christian beliefs and practices. Mark the Evangelist, traditionally identified as the author of this Gospel, is a key figure in early Christian history. According to Christian tradition, Mark was one of Jesus' disciples and later became a missionary. His role extended beyond writing the Gospel. He actively worked to spread Christianity. After Jesus' death and resurrection, his followers began to spread his teachings beyond Jerusalem. The early Christian movement initially focused on Jewish communities, but gradually reached out to Gentiles, non-Jews, as well. The Gospel of Mark, with its emphasis on Jesus' universal message, supported these efforts by providing a narrative accessible to diverse audiences. Early Christians, inspired by Mark's teachings, embarked on missionary journeys to various regions. These missionaries traveled extensively, using the Gospel of Mark as a key resource to teach and convert new followers. Their efforts were part of a broader movement to establish Christian communities across the Mediterranean and beyond. By the mid-1st century, Christian missionaries began reaching Africa. Egypt, with its bustling cities like Alexandria, was a significant destination. Alexandria was a major center of learning and commerce, making it an ideal place for spreading new ideas. According to tradition, Mark himself traveled to Egypt, where he is said to have founded the Christian church in Alexandria. In Alexandria, Mark and his followers established one of the first Christian communities in Africa. This community, known as the Coptic Church, became a foundational element in the spread of Christianity throughout Africa. The teachings and practices based on Mark's Gospel helped to lay the groundwork for Christianity's presence in the region. But he could not expand to other parts of Africa, due to some factors I'm going to share very soon in this video. Missionaries often faced resistance from local religious and political authorities. Despite these obstacles, the compelling message of Jesus' life and teachings, as presented in Mark's Gospel, helped overcome many barriers and attract new followers. In Egypt, the Gospel of Mark influenced early Christian theology by emphasizing Jesus' suffering and humanity. This focus helped to communicate Christian ideas in a way that was meaningful to new converts in Africa and other regions. The Gospel's portrayal of Jesus as a figure who experienced hardship and triumph was particularly appealing. The missionary efforts inspired by the Gospel of Mark had a lasting impact on Christianity in Africa. There was a challenge: the arrival of Islam. In the 7th century, the Arab Muslims conquered Egypt, bringing significant changes to the region. The Muslim conquest, led by Amr ibn al-As in 639 AD, marked the beginning of a new era in Egyptian history. Over time, Islam became the dominant religion in Egypt. The conversion process was gradual and influenced by a combination of factors, including social, political, and economic considerations. The Islamic rulers established a political and social system that eventually led to the widespread adoption of Islam. Egypt was then a province of the Byzantine Empire, ruled by a governor residing in Alexandria, the capital city. The inhabitants of Egypt, who were monophysite Christians known as Copts, differed from the Melkite Christian Byzantines, who regarded monophysitical sects as heretical and treated them accordingly. The difference stemmed from a disagreement over the nature of Christ. The Copts believed in his divine nature, while the Byzantines believed he was both human and divine. In consequence, the Egyptians suffered from religious discrimination and persecution at the hands of their rulers, in addition to having to put up with a heavy burden of taxation to defray the expenses incurred through constant warfare between the Byzantines and their major rivals, the Sasanian Empire. The cultural and religious landscape of Egypt shifted significantly under Islamic rule. Islamic institutions and practices became dominant, shaping the region's identity and killing the hard work of Mark in Alexandria. The Christian community, though reduced in size, yet continued to exist and contribute to the cultural diversity of Egypt, even today. Now, according to early Christian tradition, Mark was martyred in Alexandria. Mark was seized by pagans, not Muslims, in Alexandria who were angry at his efforts to turn people away from their traditional gods. They tied him with ropes and dragged him through the streets of the city until he died. This brutal death is believed to have occurred around AD 68. At the time of Mark's death, Alexandria, Egypt, was still within the Roman Empire. It was long before the Muslim religion came. The region was predominantly pagan worship with multiple gods, such as those of the ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman pantheons. Islam didn't emerge until the 7th century.
Now, if Mark did not succeed in bringing the gospel to all parts of Africa, then who did? How did it come again? Who is the major cornerstone in this?
Okay, to find out, let's travel back to the time before slavery in Africa. You see, the Portuguese were the first to go to Africa for exploration reasons, followed by the Dutch and then the British. David Livingstone, one of the British missionary explorers of the 19th century, is remembered not only for his exploration of Africa, but also for his tireless efforts to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. Born in Scotland in 1813, Livingstone arrived in Africa in 1841 as a missionary with the London Missionary Society, LMS. His journey in Africa spanned 3 decades, during which he explored vast and previously uncharted regions of the continent, all while advocating against the inhumane practice of slavery and, of course, preaching the gospel. Livingstone went to Africa to spread Christianity among the indigenous populations. He began his work in southern Africa, particularly in present-day Botswana and South Africa. He believed that Christianity and civilization could help transform African societies, but he soon realized that to achieve this, he needed to reach more people and explore further into the interior of the continent. Driven by this realization and anger, due to that, only a small number of Africans were converted to Christianity by the Dutch. Livingstone began to travel and go deeper into the heart of Africa. His travels took him across vast and challenging terrains, from the Kalahari Desert to the Zambezi River, and he became the first European to see the magnificent Victoria Falls, which he named in honor of Queen Victoria. In fact, some of the areas he went to were very remote, and sometimes even faced lions and all kinds of wildlife threats together with his team. Most of his men were even eaten alive on their way, yet it didn't discourage him. And you wouldn't believe that all this time his wife was with him. A time came when Livingstone's opposition to the slave trade grew as he continued his explorations. He became determined to expose the atrocities he witnessed to the wider world. In his writings and reports back to Europe, Livingstone vividly described the suffering of the African people and condemned the inhumanity of the slave trade. His accounts were some of the most powerful and influential testimonies against slavery at the time. In his famous work, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, 1857, Livingstone detailed his observations and experiences, bringing the reality of the African slave trade to the attention of the British public and government. His writings were widely read and contributed to the growing abolitionist sentiment in Britain. Livingstone believed that the key to ending the slave trade was to open up Africa to legitimate commerce. He argued that by developing trade routes, agriculture, and industry, Africa could create wealth and stability, which would, in turn, undermine the economic foundations of the slave trade. Livingstone's vision was encapsulated in his famous motto, Christianity, Commerce, and Civilization. To promote this vision, Livingstone embarked on several exploratory missions to map out potential trade routes and identify areas where European businesses could establish a presence. His aim was to create an alternative to the slave trade by fostering economic development that would benefit both Africans and Europeans without the exploitation of human lives. In 1866, Livingstone embarked on his final and most ambitious expedition to find the source of the Nile River. Although his primary goal was exploration, he remained committed to his anti-slavery mission. This journey, however, was fraught with difficulties, including illness, the death of most of his companions, and long periods of isolation. Livingstone's health deteriorated during this expedition, and by 1871, he had lost contact with the outside world. This led to widespread concern in Europe, culminating in the famous expedition by American journalist Henry Morton Stanley, who found Livingstone in the town of Ujiji on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871. Stanley's famous greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," became legendary. Despite Stanley's urging, Livingstone refused to return to Britain, insisting that he had to continue his work in Africa. He spent his final years trying to expose the slave trade in the region and continued to map the interior of the continent. Livingstone died in 1873 in what is now Zambia. His servants buried his heart at the foot of a nearby tree, and they carried his body to the island of Zanzibar. It is said that the trip to the Indian Ocean lasted 9 months, and in 1874 his remains reached England by boat and were buried in Westminster Abbey in London. Through him, most of the people in Africa were able to hear the word of God and also came out of slavery. These people became good Christian converts as well. So if we were to name the person who brought Christianity to Africa, then our choice would be David Livingstone. May his soul rest in perfect peace. Please subscribe if this video was useful, and also check out our other videos showing on your screen now. God bless you.